thanks for having me. These kinds of events are awesome. Lots and lots of fun. This session has always had a weird time finding a home between like PaaS events and data events and AI events and all that because it's got some of both. But I'm excited to be here. Thanks to Sam for putting this on. Here's a little bit more about me. I work for Insight. We've got offices in Columbus and Cincinnati. So if anything I talk about here, you're like, well, this sounds really cool, but we want to hire consultants to do that because we thought Matt was a nice guy. That's how you can do this. But that's kind of the end of the sales pitch. If you have any questions after this, want to reach out and ask me stuff, my email address is here. Happy to chat about any of the stuff we've talked about here. On Twitter, I am SQL at Speed, and my blog is sqlatspeed.com. A little bit more about me, and what I want to do is call your attention to the last bullet there. So I run the Lexington, Kentucky PaaS group. This is certainly not an ad for PaaS, but the fact that you're here on a Saturday doing a community event is awesome. When I started to get involved in PaaS groups and things like that, my professional life changed. So the fact that you're here trying to learn new stuff, cool stuff, is really, really great. So, you can clap for yourselves. But yeah, thanks for being here, and thanks for trying to get better at this stuff. It changes so fast that, anything we can do to expose ourselves to things that are maybe outside of what we work on. Because I think when Sam did the poll, there were like 2 or 3 people where AI stuff is part of their job now. But this session, the way I got into it, is it's very much outside of what my job was and kind of led me into more of an architect role. So hopefully some of you could kind of follow that same journey as well. I started out as a DBA, got into consulting about 5 years ago, but was still very much kind of SQL Server, Azure SQL Database focused. And I'll tell the story as I get into this, but kind of looking around the world of data and trying to find stuff I thought was cool got me into this, which has kind of opened some doors and is a big part of the reason I have the job I have now. You'll note that I said I was SQL at Speed online, and that's my blog as well, and that's really just an excuse to show this slide. I get to drive race cars once in a while. Sam, you'll like this. One of these was a Ford. But yeah, so I love talking about data, AI stuff. I really love talking about race cars. So if you think the talk was boring but want to chat racing afterwards, cool. So let's talk about what we're going to do here today. So this is kind of what we're going to walk through. And this session kind of breaks down into 3 parts. So there's so much power in the language APIs. We saw that with the first session today. I'm going to talk about the text analytics API, which is really just a small part of this. Sentiment analysis for me is pretty interesting, and as I've given this talk to data groups, seems to be a place where if you're a data person or a dev or a report builder or whatever, this is kind of somewhere where wherever we work, a lot of times this is value we can add and to make ourselves more valuable. Because as all of our jobs change, you're always trying to find places you can plug in and do something that other people can't do. So I'll kind of go through this and explain how you can use this to build a simple dashboard where maybe your marketing folks are not looking at this kind of data, but they should be. And we'll talk about some reasons for that. If that doesn't hook you, we're going to talk about what I built, which is a really silly thing to try to get on a podcast. But the power that's underneath it with Cognitive Services and Azure Logic Apps, there's so much practical stuff you can do with it. I'm hoping maybe the light bulb goes on there, even if the sentiment analysis part doesn't really grab you. And then I'll just kind of wrap up with ways that I see this being applied outside of the things I've done. I've got Q&A at the end. Feel free to shout questions at me, raise your hand, throw stuff if you want to, just make sure it's not sharp, please. But yeah, the more interactive this is, I think probably the better for everybody. So how many were familiar with the term sentiment analysis before you got here? Okay, cool. So the first hit on Google is up there. I'm not going to read that out. My definition I like better. So you're using computer magic or things that are approximately magic. Figure out how people are feeling when they tweet about something. So you'll note in this session, I focus on Twitter And that the reason for that is twofold. First of all, before we got to the third version of the text analytics API, the sentiment analysis piece worked better with smaller chunks of text. So tweets are pretty small chunks of text. So it's a great example to kind of show the power of this. And yeah, so it can do a lot more. It could do a lot more then, but it really kind of lended itself to some short examples and kind of things we can all plug into and see, okay, I understand how this works. And Twitter almost seems to be the most reflexive of the social media apps that we can use. It seems like, I don't know quite how to say it, but maybe people go on Twitter with less thought than they may spend on like Facebook or LinkedIn or something like that. So it's a really interesting case study for a couple of these things. How many were familiar with the term opinion mining? So that's kind of an older school way to talk about this. And what that came from is more or less focus groups. So if you're ever watching like a political debate or something, and they have the 15 undecided voters in a room, and they say, how did you feel when this person said that? Or they might give them dials, and you turn it up if they're happy about it, and you turn it down if they didn't like that. Opinion mining was kind of that. Sentiment analysis, to a certain extent, is kind of the electronic form of that. The line's a little blurry there, but it's really basically the same thing. This has been around for a while. But, because we have this virtual public square of Twitter and Facebook and all those sorts of things, it's a lot more important now. Because if I go out into the middle of the road and start shouting my thoughts about politics or sports or something like that, probably somebody's going to come and take me away. Nobody really cares what I have to say. But if I go on Twitter and I interact with a brand or with a politician or something like that, it may matter. People are looking at that stuff. People might retweet it. They might share it with their friends. It may turn into a viral thing. So this stuff really does matter. And it's not, it may be a crazy person shouting into the void, but people are reading the void now. This has been done in the past, so this part of this that I'm talking about is not a new thing. There's been firms for a while that have sold fancy-looking dashboards that were sentiment analysis dashboards. What's the impression of your brand on Facebook, Twitter? What do people think of your website? All those sorts of things. My brother runs a marketing firm in Akron, and companies approach him all the time with, well, we have this cool tool and it only costs $1,000 a month. And it's basically doing what I'm going to talk about here. So for those of us who, everybody here is trying to learn about this stuff. If your marketing folks are not data-driven people, this is somewhere where you can add value and say, listen, I saw this thing, I can build us something, and we can understand better how our brand is perceived. And you may think, well, I work for a small place, this doesn't matter. So there's a pizza shop fairly close to my house that ran afoul of the founder of Barstool Sports and his pizza reviews. If you don't know about that, it's fine. But one of the employees was kind of rude to him as he's filming his little 60-second video. And Barstool's got quite a following. And it became such a thing. Their Yelp pages flooded. Social media was a mess. They closed the store for 3 days to figure out how to handle it. This is a small pizza shop by my house. Pizza's pretty good. You would think it wouldn't matter. Like, they're not sitting around having meetings like our social media presence matters. But it did. They actually lost 3 days of business. It ended up kind of turning out okay. They didn't shut down permanently, but it really affected them. And it's not something you would think. So if you're sitting there and you're like, well, I have a website, I've got a presence, I make YouTube videos, or I host some event or whatever, this may matter for you too even. The cool thing is we don't have to go buy specialized tools that cost thousands of dollars a month to do this. Cognitive Services and Azure Logic Apps give us the ability to build this stuff pretty quickly and kind of instantly see that. So let's talk more about what that means. So what are the Cognitive Services APIs? So Sam had a chart up earlier. So the next slide, I'll kind of go over those briefly. Microsoft calls them sets of machine learning algorithms to solve problems in the field of AI. I think that's purposefully vague because they keep building these out to do cooler and cooler things. So that seems like, well, that's kind of an unlimited thing, right? It's kind of getting to that point where if you can think of a problem that ML can solve, there might be a cognitive services API for it. And if you work in an Amazon shop, I'm going to refer to Azure heavily here. I do have some resources at the end. Amazon does this same stuff. It's called different things, but if you're sitting out there, you're like, oh man, this stuff sounds so cool, but I only have an AWS account, you can do this too. But if I say Azure a bunch, my company's a Microsoft partner. It's just kind of how that works. So everything I'm going to show you, I wrote almost no code. I'm lazy. I don't like to write code unless I have to. That said, all this stuff can be consumed through standard REST calls. So like I have a video that you can watch. It's a little bit of a dry demo, but if you want to see how the basic dashboard is built, I build it in 8 minutes, 8.5. It's making all the calls behind the scenes. So Logic Apps gives you kind of a drag and drop design space to do that. I don't have to write any code, but you can. If you want to integrate this into other websites, apps, things like that, you can do all that. Microsoft provides actually really good documentation to do that. So if you're sitting out there and saying, well, yeah, I have some apps I think I'd like to plug this into, or I'd like to work with this, but not on a website. I want to play with it with a C# app, but I'm pretty average to below average at C#, like I am. The docs not only explain the APIs well, but provide a lot of practical examples. So if you're thinking of anything kind of basic that you're trying to do with this, that site there is going to point you in the direction of probably an example API call that you're going to be able to make sense of and drop into your app. So let's talk more about what the list of cognitive services APIs are. So we've got 5. Vision's really cool. Demo-wise, it's probably the most fun. So it analyzes images and videos to basically pick out the objects it thinks it sees. It will, for people, try to ascertain gender, age, expression on face, things like that. So you may have seen demos of it where the speaker will have a camera wired up to something here, and they'll say, like, make a wild face. And somebody goes, ah, and it will say, like, this person is surprised, or they're angry, or they're happy. So it'll do that for images and videos, and it's kind of, there is a sentiment analysis piece, but it's for visual things. Speech, there's a lot of cool development going on here. So I have a pre-conference session with a friend of mine that we'll be offering around some SQL Saturdays and some conferences this year. We have a lot of cool demos on speech, because they're putting a lot of power behind the translation aspects. So if you work for a company that's multinational and you need to interface with customers who don't just speak English, they're doing some pretty amazing things where you can talk to a bot in the language that's native to you, and it can answer in a wide variety, or all of them if you want to, and it can do that both in writing and verbally as well. This also does things like text-to-speech, speech-to-text, other stuff. Language is where we're going to spend the rest of our time here. I think this is interesting, and it's obviously where the sentiment analysis comes out of. It's understanding sentences, understanding intent, some of those sorts of things. Figure out, what people are saying, and those things, how are they actually feeling about that. Knowledge and search, I kind of group together. So knowledge is really geared towards searching for academic papers where maybe Google and Bing are not strong in that, or those are typically housed on websites where those, the crawlers for those sites don't always pick up what they're supposed to. So if you need to search for those, knowledge is kind of where you'd want to be. Search is kind of super Bing, I would almost say. I won't spend any more time talking about that. But those are kind of the 5 families. Then there's individual APIs underneath there. Everything else we're going to talk about today is the text analytics API within the language API. Any questions about any of that? Okay. So why is sentiment analysis important? So I already told a story about a little pizza shop by my house that ran afoul of somebody with a large Twitter following and lost 3 days of business because of that. For a small restaurant, that can be a pretty big deal. Thankfully, they're still open, but yeah. So this matters now because we don't have the structured news cycle like we used to. So if you were a company and you had an employee do something wrong, or you made a misstep in an ad or something like that. Maybe it was in the morning paper. Maybe you were able to call the editor and say, hey, that thing we did by accident, please don't run that. We'll buy a bunch of ads. The editor squashed it. That notion of news cycle control is largely gone now. There is no news cycle. There are still morning papers, though less than there were. But it's not it's in the morning paper, we talk about it on the news that night, and the cycle resets. It's constant because there's always news breaking. People can go on Facebook, Twitter, and all those sorts of things to see what happened, talk about what happened, maybe break their own news. Everybody's on social media all the time. And I won't talk about politics a lot here, but there are a couple tie-ins. As those divisions get wider, sometimes brands can end up accidentally aligned with one side or the other. And then people are angry at that brand because they think you support this person or this thing. So that can make all this worse. And being on the wrong end of a social media misstep, whether it's a small pizza shop or a giant brand, can have real consequences. Now, I've got a couple case studies where I talk about companies you've heard of who stepped in it pretty badly, some intentionally, some not. I say all that to say this. Any of us in here who have ever administered servers, you would generally baseline how that's running, right? It's using this much RAM, it's using this much CPU, the storage is this. Your social media sentiment, if you have any brand visibility at all, whether it's just you or where you work, you should understand what that is. And we'll talk about how this stuff gets scored. But you should know on a normal day, well, we're this. Because if you go down from that, especially significantly and fast, something happened. And you should look into what that is, and you should manage that thing. So let's talk about a couple of those case studies. So this one was a Facebook-only campaign. Dove Body Wash did it in October 2017. And what they did is basically the video that went with the Facebook ad implied that if you use their new brand of body wash and had darker skin, that you would wash that off and have lighter skin. Obviously, lots of not good implications there. People were quite upset. But what did Dove do? And there's not a lot of detailed postmortems when a company does a dumb thing like this, but piecing it together to research for this talk, it's kind of interesting. So you'll note I say it was Facebook only. The reason I point that out is because they were relying solely on Facebook's tools to figure out how this went. So if you've ever run any kind of a page on there, you'll get analytics on how many people saw the post, how many people engaged with the post and clicked into it, how many people shared the post. And you'll also get a flavor of the comments on the post. Now, if you're a major brand like this, you're probably getting thousands every 5 minutes. Facebook was obviously doing sentiment analysis behind the scenes because the vast majority of the comments that were coming up to the top of Dove looking behind the scenes of their page were positive. People that like this stuff. So all those negative comments they're not seeing. So they were relying on Facebook's own tools instead of doing the sentiment analysis themselves. So that meant basically they responded by feel. That did not go well. It was almost 2 days before they offered any sort of a response at all. And that response was pretty tepid. What were the consequences here? Not as bad as the next one that I'll talk about, but you could see where Dove's body wash sales fell off by 6 to 8% in the next 3 to 6 months. Was that all tied to this? I don't know. Maybe people just thought their body wash wasn't as good as somebody else's. But it was probably tied to this. And the point is, you can't always rely on the social media platform that you're using to market whatever you do to be honest with you about the feedback. So Facebook wasn't making any of that up, but obviously if you're buying ads on their platform, they want to present you the most positive face of that. Like, oh yeah, people love this, here's all the great comments. So they were using this technology kind of against Dove a bit, and Dove didn't realize it. So let's talk about one that was worse, where the platform wasn't really out to get them. The company did something really profoundly stupid. So, I don't know how many of you remember the Casey Anthony thing. I won't rehash the whole deal, but basically she was accused of murdering her daughter, It was a 24-hour cable news thing. People had strong feelings both ways. It was in the news for months as the trial went on and all that. So the day of the verdict, the top 2 trending hashtags on Twitter were not guilty and guilty, depending on how you felt. If you're not familiar with Entenmann's, they make breakfast pastries and stuff. Donuts, coffee cakes, muffins, delicious things. Not a brand you would ever think would end up making a social media misstep. Because everybody likes a bit of sugar, right? It's all good. They're not going to make anybody mad. Well, their social media person or team, I've never been able to find out how large a group it was, as brands do, tried to jump on the trending hashtag of the day. And they had released a new banana-flavored coffee cake. And the tweet was, "You'll feel hashtag not guilty if you try our new banana breakfast cake." I hear a few people going, "Oh, goodness." Yeah, right? So, they didn't respond to this for about a day. And this turned in, as the Dove thing did as well, to quote real news. So it wasn't just a Twitter thing, like people were publishing articles about it. It made TV news. So even if you don't live in a social media bubble, you heard about this. So their response, they did eventually figure it out after about 24 hours. We've done a dumb thing here. No real analysis was happening behind the scenes. They did the corporate equivalent of, if you've had a few too many drinks and you think you should maybe call or text your ex, and you're about to do it, and you're like, "No, that's a terrible idea." You just throw your phone across the room. They deleted their social media accounts for like 3 weeks. Just, no, we'll pretend that didn't happen. Just look the other way. Of course, the internet never forgets stuff like this, right? Screenshots everywhere. Like I said, at that point, it had turned into real news. The consequences here were interesting. So about, I think, 3 to 4 months after this happened, they closed a bakery and laid off almost 350 people. Is it directly tied to this? Probably not. Is it partially tied to this? Probably so. This was a big deal, and people were very angry about it. It was a case that triggered a lot of emotions anyway, for all the obvious reasons. But people were really upset, talking about boycotting them and all that. So this stuff really matters. I mean, we can talk about it here, and you're like, "Oh, that was dumb," but they deleted it, and off they go. People got fired because of this. I assume the social media folks as well, but I don't actually know that. So let's talk about one more case study of a company that really didn't do anything wrong. They just ran into Twitter being itself. So if you remember this was last summer. McDonald's sales fairly flat. So their marketing folks said, "You know what? A lot of people have nostalgic feelings about us. Maybe they had their first job there and now they're a CEO of something, or they used to go with their dad or their granddad or their mom and eat Big Macs and milkshakes, all this kind of stuff." So they said, "We'll invite people to tweet on this hashtag, my McDonald's story, and talk about all the wonderful nostalgic feelings they have about McDonald's, and everybody's going to want to go buy more burgers and fries and shakes." Well, Twitter did what Twitter does with things like that and made it bad. It was people tweeting about bugs in their food, and I found a finger in my fries, and all this kind of stuff. There was some nice stuff on there too, but it was, like I said, that's what it does. McDonald's didn't do anything wrong. But I'm curious, and this is where I'm going to kind of force you to be interactive, if you're willing. How would you handle that? So if you're running social media for a company that does this, would you just delete all the negative tweets or just block or mute all those people? No, I don't see any hands. Would you try to participate in the campaign and respond to those people? Or maybe write a bot, and we're going to have a session on bots later, I think, after lunch. Write a bot that's going to respond to those people. I'm like, well, if the sentiment is negative, then I'm going to send them a digital coupon for something, or I'm going to give a canned response. Maybe you do that. By all indications, they did monitor the sentiment of what this was. They brought the campaign to a fairly graceful but early end. So they didn't do anything wrong. There was no lasting impact from here. But it's a reminder, if you start a conversation online and you're a company, or like I said, you have any brand presence at all, it's a good idea to keep an eye on it, because it may not go where you think, because nobody on Twitter does what they're told. So any questions about the sentiment analysis piece? Because now we're going to dive into the tech. Okay. So how did I, a DBA, data architect person who spends a lot of time with SQL Server and Azure SQL DB and all that, get into cognitive services and AI type work? It's these guys' fault. So if you don't recognize this logo, it's these two guys. They make a soccer podcast about the English Premier League. They also have a TV show on NBCSN. It's on Monday nights during the season, most of them. So they're English, and that's important to understand for the rest of this. The humor is fairly dark. This is by no means a serious tactical breakdown of every match. So if you're a hardcore soccer fan, into all the analytics and all that, not the podcast or show for you. If you like English humor and like soccer a little bit, it's pretty good. So I was driving to a client to do an always-on availability group health check, traditional SQL Server work. And I'm listening to their podcast. And it was 2 seasons ago. Manchester City, I think, had won the first 10 matches of the season. So all the pundits were saying, well, they're going to win. They're almost impossible to catch. Spoiler alert, they did win. So they were joking, and the podcast is several years old. They said, well, we're going to stop doing the podcast. This is completely useless. Manchester City's spending too much money. They've ruined the entire league. Nothing matters. And I said, but what would matter is if we had, instead of rankings by the points and the results on the field, rankings of how the supporters of these teams feel. That's what matters. They were joking, as they usually are. But I had just read a blog that we'll talk about in a slide about cognitive services. These APIs had just gone into public preview at that point, or some of the ones that I used did. And I had just read a blog. I was like, well, I know these guys are joking, but I've listened to the podcast enough to know they're always kind of halfway serious. And like, if you do the thing they joke about, they might mention you. It's like, I like their podcast. A lot of my friends did. Like, well, maybe if I build something like that, they'll talk about me. So I was going to a client for a week. Social calendar is pretty light when you're going on a customer engagement, and this one happened to be in the middle of nowhere. So I built this over a couple nights. Sent them an email saying, I know you guys were joking, but here's this nerdy way that you can do this. Blew their mind. They're not technical at all. One guy's in TV, one guy's a writer, not in any way involved in technology. It did become a regular feature on the podcast. So it ran for about a season. So I'll kind of pause here. The fact that you're here means we all love this stuff. And we're all at different levels of learning about it and trying to figure out what we can do with this. Keeping your eyes and ears open to engage with maybe, things you might know about or might have an advantage on learning about that can help other folks. That's how I got into this. I then started a company where we did some of this. It's a part of the reason that I have my job now. So staying aware of what we can do with data, what we can do with AI, especially because it's the thing, these are things a lot of people don't understand, but the fact that we're all here learning about it, we're a step ahead of everybody else. So even if you think it was stupid, the things you're going to learn from doing a stupid thing with cool stuff are going to help you, because that's what I did. So I got to go to the TV studio. I was not on TV, but it looks like I was. And they were sponsored by Guinness at the time, so I got to drink free beer, which is always good. So let's talk about the blog that got me here. My boss that hired me into consulting is a guy named Brad Ball. He works for Microsoft now. His blog's still a pretty good read. He used to be a SQL Server internals person and now does a lot of AI stuff on the Azure customer experience team there. So he's SQL Balls on Twitter. That's his blog as well. The way he got into this was he's into superhero movies and things like that. So he was trying to figure out if you could predict ultimate box office by the sentiment of the official hashtag. So the trailer drops and it's hashtag Avengers Endgame or hashtag Wonder Woman, whatever. So he wanted to see the sentiment on that hashtag, people's impressions of the trailer and the ad campaign and all that sort of stuff. Can you project accurately what the final box office will be? Because those trailers do matter. They spend a lot of time and money just to make those, because it's the first impression of that film. So he was just doing things with a single hashtag. So I took what he did, and I was like, well, there's 20 Premier League clubs. I need a table. Can can I do this 20 times? And so that's where Azure Logic Apps kind of comes into the picture here. And we'll talk about what all these mean. So what my mood table ended up doing was ranking the clubs by the supporter sentiments within the last 10 minutes of the match. It originally started scanning throughout the entire match. Really funny story about that we'll get to in a couple minutes. But what they ultimately wanted is when you turn to your friends at the bar, no matter which sport you like, and you're like, oh, that was a great game, that was a lousy game, we're terrible, whatever. They wanted the Twitter version of that so they could talk about what the fans thought. So technically, how did I do this? There's really only 4 parts. There's an Azure SQL database. And all I did was use it to store sentiment scores. The only bit of code I wrote for this was querying those and ranking them and sending them off. There's a logic app for each club. And I'll talk more about what those are in a couple minutes. They are really powerful. I did such a silly thing with them. But hopefully you walk out of here if you didn't know about those, and a lot of folks when I give this talk don't. There's cool stuff you can do at work with these right now. We're also using the Text Analytics API. We've talked about that a bit. We'll talk about it a little bit more. And there had to be a scheduling piece. Now, you'll note I have an asterisk next to that. You'll understand when I get to that slide why I do. But scheduling those, just like anything in Azure or any cloud, cost management is an important part of this. So all the stuff that I built, you can go home and build it on the free tier of stuff, except for the database, I think, though depending on the nature of your account, you'll get so much Azure SQL for free. But even so, it would cost maybe $5 to build all of this. But yeah, cost management is important if you're trying to scale that at all, or if you're just trying to get on a podcast. So it came out looking like this, and they were going for like the 80s video game thing. They imagined that I had constructed a giant server room next to my house that did all this. Didn't really understand the cloud, but it made for funny podcast stuff. So the interesting part about the sentiment analysis is it doesn't always go the way that you think. So you'll see the results here, and you'll see there's a small club. They were 4th. They lost. They lost to Manchester United, big club. Even if you're not a soccer fan, you've probably heard of them. Their fans were pretty thrilled with it because they had played them tough. They conceded a goal kind of late, but they were proud of the guys. Fans are pretty positive. So in these top 10, you don't see Manchester United anywhere even though they won, right? They're 15th. Their fans were mad because they had played a tough match against a club whose player, they probably pay them 5% of what they pay their guys. Their fans were upset. So it kind of underscores with the sentiment analysis, it doesn't always go where you predict, whether you're analyzing feelings about sports, politics, brands, whatever. So it is kind of an important thing to keep an eye on. So back to the guts of this. This part was by far not the most advanced database I've ever done. Single database, single table. And what it does is it stores all the Twitter information we care to store. So it would store the account, the location if they specified it. Caveat there is Twitter doesn't really allow you to get a person's location by their IP address. You have to take it out of the profile. Now, what we found when we had a company that was doing this on the side, before I went to Insight, who does this kind of work too, is that about 80% of the people were honest with their location, or it was at least a real place. 20% were comedians. So, for every person you'd say that was like Sioux City, Iowa, for 4 of those, you'd have one that was like on a bar stool, under my bed, on my floor. So the rule we kind of went with is for clients that cared about that location and trying to get as precise as they could, if it was more than 3 words, we generally filtered it out. Now, depending on what you're looking at and what state or country, that may or may not be a good rule. But you have to trust everything that's in the tweet. We also stored interesting information you get back from the search about how many original tweets does this account have. So if you're trying to figure out whether or not it's a bot, one of the ways you could do is if it does not have its own original tweets. It's just retweeting. So it's an account somebody set up, just retweets everything about a particular soccer club or a company or something like that. For the podcast, we didn't care. For clients that we talked to about this, they wanted to know, like, is this artificial noise or is this real people being angry? So depending on what you're trying to analyze, you might want to know that stuff. So the scoring. This has changed, and on the next slide I'll explain what that is. This still exists, but in version 3 of text analytics, they made it a lot more useful for bigger chunks of text. So the scoring, 1 is the most positive, 0 is the most negative. You'll never see 1, you'll never see 0, but it gets very close to each. And I've got some examples later where you can see the score that it outputs. 0.5 is the API throwing its hands up and saying, I don't know. So it could be an image there, it could be a video, and you could wire the two APIs together. That's more work than we were ever asked to do, but it is technically feasible. And for the pre-con I'm building, we'll show some of how you can get them both to kind of play nice. But yeah, if you ever see a 0.5, you can filter those out. It's something that it's failed to score. And for whatever reason, they decided on 0.5 with nothing after it as the signal for that. So like I said, I did all this with Text Analytics API version 2. Version 3 entered public preview in July 2019, and then Microsoft did an announcement at Ignite, kind of diving more into the coolness of this. So that was first week of November. So you could always detect the sentiment of a document, but you were just doing it as a chunk of text. So whether it was a tweet or a family member on Facebook who made a giant post about some politician they do or don't like, you were just getting that single score at the end. So if there was a blend of sentiment in there, I like politician X because they think this, but then I don't like him for all these other reasons. You lost context. With version 3, you get that context back. So you can get the sentiment score of the whole chunk of text. You can get the sentiment score of individual sentences in there, and it will also return categories. So you can get this score like we've used here. So if you want numeric data, and we'll talk about some ways you could use this, like if somebody tweets at you and the score is low enough where you want to trigger an email to customer support and say, go look at this tweet and reach out to this person and see why they're mad, or something like that, you still get that single score. But you'll also get kind of a sentiment map. Well, here's some positive things, here's some negative things, neutral and mixed. So where that's useful, and we'll talk more about applications at the end, beyond just a thing for a silly podcast, is if you're using this like you work for a software company like Highland, and you release a new version, and your most engaged users are going to go on support forums or something like that and say, oh, the new version's great, or I love this feature, I hate this feature, or everything broke, or here's the list of things that broke. You'll want to respond quickly to things like that, especially if you're anywhere where you have a community of your most engaged users talking about your stuff. You'll want to sentiment analyze that and be able to respond to it. Version 3 gives us a much more nuanced ability to do that. And it's pretty cool. You won't see it here because for our purposes, we didn't need it. And it also didn't exist until a couple months ago. So I'll go into Logic Apps, and then we'll take time for questions and a demo. So how many had heard of Azure Logic Apps before you got here? Yes. All right. These things are really cool. So what Microsoft calls them is a cloud service that helps you automate and orchestrate tasks, business processes, and workflows. For me, they're kind of workflow containers. And under the covers, they are very much containerized. They do scale themselves. They're kind of entities that spin themselves into existence and kill themselves when they're done. These, you can do ETL with them. These have all sorts of applications. There are 250 plus first-party connectors in Azure now. They're adding those all the time. You can also code your own. These can connect to anything in any cloud, basically. They're just API calls under the covers. And you can do amazingly powerful stuff with these. You can move healthcare data around. You can do all sorts of things. Most people don't know about them. They've done a terrible job marketing them. But as I started to play with this, I basically took what Brad did, built it out a little farther, and as I'm working on it, I was like, this would be an interesting like SQL Saturday community type talk. And as I got more into Logic Apps to understand them, wow, these things are actually really amazing, and nobody seems to know about them. So definitely check these out, and we'll look at what one looks like, and hopefully you get a flavor of how easy they are to work with too. So I made one per club. A Logic App starts from a trigger. So it's an event-driven workflow. When a thing happens, do all these steps. So the trigger that I used is when a new tweet is posted. And we'll see in the example how that works. It then feeds the text of the tweet to the text sentiment action in the text analytics API. Then its final step is an insert row action into Azure SQL DB. So in the Logic App design space, you basically say when a thing happens, do these steps, and you can have conditional logic in there and loops and all those sorts of things as well, but you're defining actions for it to take, and then it, in theory, dies, except when it doesn't. Like I said, there's a story about that. The original version also streamed to Power BI, so it used a streaming data set there to do like live sentiment. Like if you're watching a debate, and some of the networks will do this, where they'll have those kind of dials where there's people in a room saying, yes, I like what that person said, and they turn all the way up, and it does that. Oh, no, that's terrible. Down it goes. So I had it kind of doing this, but for soccer matches, something completely useless. So, we've covered a lot of ground here in 40 minutes. Any questions about this while I get the demo set up? Yeah. So this uses, so you'll note I said first-party connectors. So like this is using the Twitter search API. My understanding is that like Twitter basically wrote this for them. So you can code your own, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff. And in fact, before I get into what the design space is, so I provisioned the Logic app earlier today, which basically you just go up to the search bar. Here, I'll zoom in. You just go up to the search bar, type Logic app, create one. Once you create one, it goes to the screen. And here it says start with a common. So the most common triggers you see here is when a message is received in a service bus queue, if you're using Event Grid or something like that in Azure, when a new file is created in OneDrive. This will hook into ServiceNow. This will hook into a lot of healthcare data integration platforms and things like that. So all of it is when this thing happens, do the next thing. So when you click when a new tweet is posted, you get to something like this. Now I'll try to keep zooming in and out. Unfortunately, this doesn't always render the best zoomed, but we'll try to do our best here. So, if you're a soccer fan, you may have noted I supported Spurs, or I still do, so that's what we're going to look at here. The search text, oddly enough, this is the first Logic app I ever built. The first version of this connector could not search with the hashtag character. They since fixed that, but I'm showing you the first one I built, so that's why the hashtag is missing. I was searching against the official handle of each club. So you've got your search text here. Then it says, how often do you want to check for items? So what is that interval? So the first version of this, I said, well, I want a minute. It lies. And so if you're looking at this, you're like, man, this is cool. I want to go play with this. I want to build this dashboard. Bear in mind that it lies. And the story I have about it is this. So the first weekend, I had sent them, I did like a simple POC. It was like 2 clubs. And I sent off to them and said, here's what I can send you. And they're like, oh, this is mind-blowing. This is so cool. We're going to use it on the pod in 2 weeks. There was a big match weekend coming up, lots of rivalry matches. They would have a lot of listeners. They wanted something kind of unique to throw in there. So I was all excited. And they're like, yeah, we're going to talk about you on the pod. We'll send you some stuff. I was like, oh, this is great. So I create all 20 things, get it all spun up, start them that morning, went out with the family to shop and do stuff, and got home that night. Like, I've got all this data. This is awesome. This is great. And I had the interval originally set for every 15 minutes. So basically, including halftime, 7 times a match, it would supposedly go out and say, okay, here's all these tweets. I'm going to score all these, and then I'm going to go to sleep. So I get home that night. I'm looking at all this. I was like, wow, there's way more data than I thought I would get. I had like 25 million rows of stuff. I go to my cost management tab. $705. I did not need sentiment analysis on my wife's face when I happened to casually mention, hey, honey, I just spent $700 to get on a podcast. The story has a happy ending, though. So I immediately texted Brad. I was like, you've worked with this stuff more than I have. What did I do? He's like, I think you found a bug. Like, that's how it's supposed to shut down. You specify the interval here and it dies. So I tweeted that night at the Azure support account. I didn't have a support agreement. I wasn't an MVP then, so I had no special strings to pull. I said, hey, I think I found a Logic App bug. They responded right back, probably via a bot, and said, DM us all your stuff and we'll go look at it. So I did. They answered back in like 2 hours and said, yeah, the documentation is wrong. We'd like to schedule a call to go over that with you. That's where the scheduling piece came in that we'll talk about. But they're like, well, we're really excited you're playing with this stuff. It's pretty new. For this mistake, because the documentation's pretty crappy, we're going to waive your initial charge. So score. Happy your wife also, which is good. So yeah, so this is the event that I chose. So it connects to a Twitter account to use the search API. I happen to use mine. Then the next thing we do is I add an action to detect sentiment. So before I did this, you would type cognitive services into the search bar, and on this subscription, you would create a connection to the cognitive services API, which gives you the ability to make all these calls here. I wanted to score the tweet text. So, and hopefully you can see this. It's still going to render okay. So I pulled that in. The way I did that is when you add this action, you get this dynamic content off to the side, which is basically the output of the trigger. So it's like all this stuff from a tweet that you can pull. There's a long, long list of stuff. Well, I just want to score the text, right? So I did that, and then this went into an insert row action for an Azure SQL database. And you can store this just about anywhere. Azure SQL is pretty easy and very cheap. And so then basically you connect it to a database down at the bottom, and then you specify all the stuff from the event and the preceding steps that I want to store. Once you connect it and say, I want it in this table, it will give you the boxes, and then you just drag and drop stuff in. So I didn't write a line of code to do this. There's a bunch of JSON behind the scenes, and I can show that to you here. So if you really want to nerd out and write some code even though you don't have to, here's what one of these looks like. It's just kind of a wall of JSON, but if you're like, well, I don't feel like I'm doing cool stuff unless I'm writing code, there it is. Any questions about that while I go back to this? So it's a documentation bug. It's not a real bug. And the reason is this stuff, so if it only stops when it stops seeing activity. And that's still not well documented. They changed the docs, but they didn't change it to what I wanted it changed to, which is fine. So the problem is I'm checking tweets in theory every 15 minutes for the Twitter handles of international soccer clubs that are playing a big match right then. It never stops. There's always people tweeting, or there's bots retweeting stuff, and it's sucking all that stuff in. So it never gets a chance to die. So when it stops activity is when the interval starts. But once I started it, it never stopped. So it ran for 110 minutes or so with halftime, and spun a lot of money really fast. So cost management is very important, which is a great segue into this slide. So they recommended use Azure Scheduler to manage this stuff. You need to schedule it. You need to kill the apps manually because it works like I just said. Like if it's constantly getting traffic, it never shuts off. It's spinning up individual Logic Apps the whole time. So Azure Scheduler was the way to do this. And basically what this was is a really nice graphical interface for API calls that said, this Logic App over here, die on the schedule that I've set. But I had an asterisk on the slide before where I talked about this. I have one here. So rudely, without asking me, they deprecated this, September 30th, 2019. If you had scheduler resources already, they're out there until New Year's Eve, but at midnight, they go away too. And it's like they never existed. This is a bummer. Wiring this up to Azure Scheduler is the way I really learned kind of how these look behind the scenes, what the API calls look like, and all that. So if you're really interested in this stuff, I would encourage you to go to my blog, search for Men in Blazers Deep Dive, or just Deep Dive. I have in too much detail exactly how I built all this stuff. And I go deeply into the scheduling piece. I talk about what the API calls look like, the different IDs and keys you have to know to talk to this stuff. It makes for a really dry presentation, so it's not here. But in that blog, I've got screenshots and how I put this together. I would still encourage you to read that, because the new way that they recommend to do this, so I said like every logic app starts from a trigger, right? So the new way they want you to do this is, instead of Azure Scheduler, they want you to create a logic app that starts with a recurrence trigger, which is basically wake this logic app up at this time. The call of that logic app is an API call to the one you want to kill. It says die. And that will all make sense if you go into the deep dive and see the way that my API calls were built. As good as the documentation is on everything we've talked about, the documentation on killing a logic app for me, I think, is still pretty bad. That's why I felt the need to kind of write my own. Brad's blog has some good stuff too. If you're like, wow, this guy's really annoying, I don't ever want to go to his blog, go to SQLballs.com and you can see how to do it as well. Another brief demo here before we wrap this up. So what I want to show you is kind of what the mood table looked like behind the scenes. And I will zoom in on this stuff. And apologies in advance. This was raw data for a client of the side company I have. There is salty language in these tweets, because this particular team, which if you're an MLS fan, you'll know who it is, they weren't very good in this particular section of time. So if you see words that offend you, sorry. So here's a tweet, fairly simple. Somebody tweets out, says, I don't like this club anymore. So what did sentiment analysis do with that? .0014, really bad. So like I said, you'll never see 0. And in fact, I've seen tweets where it's just a string of curse words that it knows is really bad, but it will be like .0000123 something. But obviously this was poor. So what does a good one look like? So this is somebody, it's their first soccer pro game. They enjoyed it so much. Thank you, club. So what, let me see, what score did we get out of that one? Probably pretty good, right? Very good, .9899. Really hard to get a more positive score than that, but it was a very positive tweet. So like I said, with version 3 now, you can still get this raw score, but you get a much richer data set out of it, especially for larger chunks of text. Any questions about that before we go back to the slides? Okay. All right. So like I mentioned, I'm talking about Azure. My company's a Microsoft partner, so we do a lot of Azure stuff. AWS can do this too, so you're not left out. They call it, of course, different things, but here's kind of the components that you use. So their cognitive services stuff is called, well, I would say their version of the language API is called Comprehend, so probably a cooler name. It does a lot of the same stuff. There's a variety of ways to simulate kind of what logic apps do, those miniature like workflow containers. They have some scheduling options like CloudWatch events as well. What's really nice about this, and it's on my resources slide at the end, is they wrote a blog that is fantastic, that is basically building what I built, not for soccer clubs, but kind of a sentiment analysis dashboard. So they wrote the Amazon version of what I did, and the blog's really, really good. So I've got that link. So what are some ways we can apply this that have nothing to do with soccer that are actually practical? So like I mentioned, you can transfer data between 2 different systems, particularly if you have a server where maybe there's not a natural interface from it to another one. And as I've given this talk, I've gotten to do it internationally a few times and here. It's really interesting to hear the examples of what people do. I could think of one case where they had a server in a hospital that was it was running a critical system. The vendor had gone out of business. The vendor had stopped supporting SQL Server after SQL Server 2000 Service Pack 4. But the risk management people in the hospital said, no, you can't upgrade this because the vendor didn't certify it beyond that. And it's like, well, the vendor's out of business. Well, it doesn't matter. And it keeps working. they needed to get that data out of there. They had some cloud-based EMR stuff, and they needed the data from that critical system up into Azure. Logic Apps is the way that they did that. And you could connect to some on-site network stuff, get the data out of there, so you have this server that's basically cut off from the rest of your system for security reasons and things like that, but you had a way to pull the data. So I thought that was really interesting and kind of shows you, like, and that's not strictly ETL, it's just getting the data out of something, but you can use these for that sort of thing. I'm not saying ditch all your ETL tools and only use Azure Logic Apps, but they're cool for that. I talked about knowledge-based posts and things like that, especially with Text Analytics version 3, the richer set you get back. If your company has support forums and things like that, or you have any reason to kind of sentiment analyze larger chunks of text, it's really powerful for that. An interesting case study, and I've gotten this a few times when I've talked, is there are school districts using cognitive services, and I know there are privacy implications here. But, unfortunately, when we see school violence, a lot of times the pattern is there was a dark series of social media posts, something had taken a turn in that person's life, and they either harmed themselves or harmed the school or people at it. There are districts that, if there are kind of kids on those watch lists for maybe we might have an issue down the road here, they are using sentiment analysis to analyze the social media posts of the students and have that sentiment baseline. If it starts to take a turn, then maybe you'd request a counseling visit, or you have the police do a wellness check or something like that. Like I said, privacy implications aside, it's an interesting application of just the sentiment part of this. Some cool stuff that you could do. So everything I've talked about is live events. You can use, and there's libraries in Python, and there's a library in Python, and there's a library in R called rtweet. You can do this in the past. Now the Twitter search API, so the Logic app, it always works because Twitter is kind of playing along with it. The search API itself is a bit of a moving target, and what they don't want you to be able to do is say, give me 1 billion tweets that I've searched for. So they make it pretty difficult to get the data back in kind of a data frame way. So rtweet can be a challenge. I never got very far with it because we never had clients who wanted to go in the past. It was always live stuff. There's some interesting case studies out there about people using rtweet to get tweets in the past to do this kind of analysis. And then, like, if you want to, getting back to some of the stuff we talked about this morning, you can actually put ML models together where if you're in industry or sport or something where the jargon's very specific, then you can enhance the sentiment analysis piece with understanding that language. But doing it on the fly like I did is pretty tough. I want to call your attention to this thing. So one of the large clubs we worked with moved into a new stadium the year after we worked with them. As part of that, they stress tested their old stadium. They had a giant youth soccer tournament in town, 8,000 extra fans. They invited all the teams, free tickets, come and watch us. Normal capacity was 21,000. They had 29 that night. They didn't tell us. But we got urgent phone calls, which was really weird because this was not an on-call type thing, at midnight that night. The stress test had gone really wrong. They ran out of a bunch of food, stuff in the stadium broke, all that. So they called us and said, hey, your Twitter stuff, what do you have that's bad? So we went and looked, and we're like, oh my goodness, they actually won the match. But they were overwhelmed with people tweeting at them. But, oh, you're out of food, you're out of beer, the gate's busted, the ticket scanners don't work, all this sort of thing. So what we put together for them is we gave them a match day hashtag. So there's signs all over the place when you walk in. Tweet us your experience at blah, 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 match day. And because what we noticed is people were very detailed. They weren't just like, I think you guys suck. It was, there's a problem at gate 2. The beer hall stand 2 or whatever has this, they're out of beer. So what we gave them is a simple Power BI streaming dashboard. And I have the link to the video on my site. I built it in 8 minutes for a demo for Past Summit 2 years ago. And it's just a line. And we told them, we know on your normal match day, pre-match, you're at a 0.65. If you see the line go down, click through that line, it would give them raw what the text of the tweets were, so they could go say, all right, we need people at gate 2, we need food service people at this beer hall. It's simple. Like I said, there's a demo on my site. It's no smoke and mirrors. built it in 8 minutes, that has all kinds of applications for live sentiment if you have to respond in that way, whether you're running a soccer club or your company feels like they might need to respond quickly for things like that. That link is here. And it's also on sqlatspeed.com/resources as well. If you were totally captivated by this, you're like, but I want to write more code and I want to understand all kinds of stuff that Logic Apps do. This slide makes me uncomfortable, but they made me do it when I wrote the course. I wrote an 8-hour training course for Pragmatic Works that dives way into Logic Apps. So questions you might have about like scaling and stuff I didn't cover in here at all. Click through that. There's a discount code there. It impresses my wife when I get a note that people buy this. But if you really want to nerd out on Logic Apps, that's a pretty good way to do it. So what are some takeaways here? Like I've said over and over, if you have any social media presence at all, it's good to know what people think of you or your company. If your marketing people aren't doing this, they should be. And my favorite feedback from this talk is when I get an email 3 months afterwards where somebody built their marketing people a dashboard to look at this and got a promotion because of it. That's happened twice. So that's a really cool thing you can do with this. Any of us here, we can have a role, whether it's sentiment analysis, whether it's even just cognitive services and the things we can do with it. It's magic under the covers, but we've seen already 2 sessions today on how to interact with it pretty easily, and Logic Apps make that very easy. ML is really important. It's a part of almost everything we're doing here. You don't have to understand the way machine learning works. Most of my professors would tell you I was not a good enough computer science student to understand this stuff. But it's important to try to understand and kind of see, how does ML govern what happens with the things that I'm working on? I've hammered this point too, but cognitive services, Logic Apps, a really powerful combination to do a lot of really amazing things and make it look pretty easy. And the last takeaway, and this is by far the most important, is I am such a big dork that I rank soccer teams based on feelings to get on a podcast, but it gets me to events like this and get to talk about cool stuff. So with that, thank you very much. Resources are here, and I think it's lunchtime, so go eat. Thanks for having me.